Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. In this video, I want to continue a discussion that we started previously. And the discussion involved how you as a buyer broker, with a buyer brokerage services agreement already in place between you and your buyer, and you are going to be unavailable for some period of time to be able to meet the needs of your buyer to see homes, and you want another broker to assist you. We talked about how to ask a broker who's licensed to the same firm as yours to assist you. They're going to be added to your firm's Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement through a Form 41A. That's easy. But what about when you need a buyer broker who's licensed to a different firm to step in and show homes to your buyer in your absence? That broker cannot be made an agent of the buyer through your firm's Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. That buyer broker is going to have to enter a brand new Form 41 Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement with that buyer, creating an agency relationship between the buyer and that broker's firm. And in doing that, the buyer will have signed two Buyer Brokerage Services Agreements, one to your firm and one to the other firm. How do you do that without creating a scenario where buyer owes two sets of compensation to two different buyer brokers for the same transaction? Because that's not the goal. You and the other broker are going to have already reached your own agreement about how you're going to compensate one another, how you're going to share compensation, but you're certainly not doubling the buyer's compensation obligation. The buyer is still going to pay that same amount of compensation that they had originally agreed to pay. How it gets split is decided between you and the other broker below the radar. With respect to drafting the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreements, there's a variety of ways that you can do it. If, for example, the buyer had agreed that they were going to pay you 10 apples compensation, then you could modify your Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement to 5 apples compensation and make it an exclusive contract. And the other buyer broker could enter a Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement for 5 apples and make it an exclusive contract. And the exclusivity means that when buyer purchases property that is within the area defined by those contracts, the buyer owes compensation to the buyer brokerage firm. So if there's 2 different contracts, both of them are exclusive, both of them are for 5 apples, then the buyer owes a total of 10 apples when the buyer purchases property. And if that was the original objective, then we've accomplished that outcome. Or you could have an arrangement where if you've already got your Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement in place, buyer's going to pay you 10 apples and you've got an exclusive contract, then the second Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement that's drafted between the new buyer broker and the buyer could also say 10 apples compensation, but it would be a non-exclusive agreement. The fact that it's non-exclusive means that the broker with the non-exclusive agreement will only be paid compensation if they write the offer, which then also means that you and the other broker must have an agreement between yourselves that when the buyer writes an offer, you're going to be the broker who writes the offer. The broker with the exclusive buyer agency agreement will be the buyer who writes the offer. Sometimes people say, well, why wouldn't you just make that second Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement be for 0 compensation? Because the compensation's already coordinated between the 2 brokers. So why not just make the second one 0? I think that would be foolish. Because what if, for some unpredictable reason, buyer is unable to write the offer with that first broker, and so they write the offer with the second broker. And now the compensation that's owing to the second broker under that second Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement is 0 compensation. So I would never do that. I would write the second Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement for the amount of compensation that you want to have paid in total, but make it non-exclusive. That way, the buyer can write their offer with the exclusive agent owing compensation to that exclusive office, have no compensation obligation to the non-exclusive office, and then the two firms already have their agreement in place to share compensation. That agreement should also make clear that it is the exclusive agent's office that will write the offer earning compensation. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.